Hey everyone, I wanted to give a preview for this Sunday's Adult Sunday School class. We're going to be looking at chapter 6 on Chris Wright's book, Here Are Your Gods. Chapter 6 is God in the Political Arena. And Wright reminds us that God, in his word, provides multiple laws to govern those who governed. And Israel's laws revealed the principles and patterns of God's will for all the nations to follow. It wasn't merely laws for Israel or rules for the church or things like that, but it showed a pattern for all people to follow. There's a number of standards that we could draw from, but three that stand out and that Chris Wright uses in this chapter are the standards of modesty, integrity, and justice. First, the law of modesty. In Deuteronomy 17:14-20, we have the law set forth about what a king could or could not and was to do as he governed. One of the things that we see in this passage is that the king was to get a copy of the law of God from the priest and meditate upon it regularly, day and night. And there were three things that the king was prohibited from accumulating. One, he was not to accumulate many horses. That translates into military strength. A horse in the ancient world was like a battle tank. And so he was to be modest in terms of his own acquisition of military power. We also see that he was prohibited from the increase in many wives. Not only did this have to do with sexual profligacy, but also foreign entanglements that the king was to avoid. Those things would both get him in trouble. It would turn his heart away, and so forth. And then finally, the office of the king was not to be a place for the accumulation of personal wealth. They were not to gain for themselves or acquire for themselves much gold and silver. Next, we see integrity. The accountability in public office was also something that God was very concerned about. Samuel is a good example of this. He's kind of what we call a liminal figure. He's sort of somewhat like a judge and somewhat like a king, but because of this, he serves as a good example for political leadership. And in 1 Samuel 12:1-5, he speaks about his time. This is his farewell speech, and he speaks about his time when he will step down, and he speaks about his time as a judge for Israel. And the two things that really stand out is that he did not personally profit from his time in public service, and nor did he betray the public trust. He never took a bribe. He was committed to justice and truth-telling. And then later, in 1 Samuel 8:10-20, Samuel will warn Israel about the kings that will come, that they will do exactly the opposite of this. Third, we see that God's concern for those who govern is a commitment to justice. And this is God's fundamental demand. We see good description of this in Proverbs 31. But God's word sees doing justice as the primary feature of government. And so we can look at passages, and we will look at passages like Jeremiah 22 and famous passages like Amos 5:24 and Micah 6:8. We also see that the Bible exposes the idols that God rejects. And we look at three of them here in this chapter. One is the idol of prosperity, the idol of national pride, and the idol of self-exaltation. First of all, the idol of prosperity. We see this in Job, where Job speaks of not letting silver and gold steal his heart. And Wright takes up some time looking at the reasonableness of why it made sense for people to worship Baal in ancient Israel. It wasn't necessarily seen as giving up Yahweh, their national deity, but it was sort of trying to leverage and gain a sense of of security for the future. Baal was the god of fertility, and so if you wanted your crops to grow, you would worship him. There was a very reasonableness to this idolatry, and that makes it all the more insidious. And that's something to kind of take stock of in our modern world, that there is always a reasonableness to idolatry, and that's something that should be a warning for us. But today we also see prosperity affecting our lives in terms of consumerism, how much of our life is taken up in the acquisition of stuff, and how much that sort of rules our lives, what the New Testament calls mammon. And then we even see things like this in the church. Wright points to the problem of the prosperity gospel that we too often see. Next, we also have the idol of national pride. And he looks at 1 Kings 12, 26 through 33. We see the story of Jeroboam here, and how Jeroboam sets up two statues of bull calves to serve as an alternative to the temple in Jerusalem for the people of the northern kingdom. But in doing so, he intertwines these places of idolatry with national identity and national pride. And you see this, how the church, so to speak, is in service to the state. And we see this in this amazing exchange between Amaziah and Amos in Amos 7, verses 12 to 13. But Wright also speaks about how national pride can express itself in grasping for military security, where a nation makes military security the most important thing, the most central thing in terms of its existence as a government. And he also speaks, though, too, of our own hearts and how we can be swayed by the longing for personal security, and how that can become a dominant feature in our lives, to the point where we are not taking risks in serving and loving and making ourselves vulnerable to others. He brings up the controversial subject of how America and guns relate in our culture. So that might be an interesting thing to talk about on Sunday. Next, we also identify the idol of self-exaltation, just the sense of pride and the centrality of the self, and he points to Isaiah 2, but also we look at just how our culture and our world is taken up in what we would call narcissism, where there's so much self-consumption. People are consumed with themselves, and so you see this in the political culture, where our leaders are narcissistic, even to the point of being sociopathological. But we see it also in advertising. You be you. You are the most important thing. Believe in yourself. All these sort of messages that our advertising world sort of presents to us, as well as it spills over into popular culture. You can be anything you want to be, and all of these sort of messages that our culture continues to communicate really exposes an idol of self-exaltation. Finally, he closes the chapter looking at how the Bible discerns the judgment that God operates within history. In other words, what he's saying is that there is a price to be paid for this idolatry, and we see it in various ways in various nations and over the course of history. And we ought not to shy away from seeing these things as God's judgments. In other words, you reap what you sow, and if you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And so we see this in terms of increasing economic disparity between the few very, very rich and the increase in the number of people who are in poverty. We see corruption in political systems. We see deals being made and things like that that do not place the well-being and the common good of our society up front, but rather who can gain an advantage. We also see corruption in the judicial system. We see that too often, even in America, as it's been said, that if you are wealthy and guilty, you will often fare better in the courts than if you're poor and innocent. Uh, we also see an increase in violence in many different forms throughout our culture and society. We also see widespread sexual promiscuity. And then finally, we have developed and cultivated a culture of lies, moral confusion, and shamelessness. A lot of nasty stuff. And the takeaway here is that idolatry is something to be taken very seriously. Anyway, that's a brief sort of survey of chapter 6, and I look forward to discussing this with you on Sunday. Take care.